Police officers share their most disturbing calls. Story 1. I remember when my dad, a police officer, shared a particularly eerie story with me. One night, he was called to a house because a woman reported men breaking in. When he arrived, it was clear she wasn't entirely mentally sound. She mumbled incoherently, seemed paranoid, and her house was covered in crosses, 6 or 7 on every wall. My dad calmed her down and searched the house thoroughly. There were no signs of a break-in, but she kept insisting, "That's how they got in," pointing to doorknobs or window latches. What really gave him chills was when she whispered things like, "They're here again," or "He's right behind us." Even though he found nothing, the atmosphere left him deeply unsettled. Story 2. I arrived to assist paramedics struggling with a petite Singaporean woman. She was on the floor, hissing and trying to bite one of the paramedics. Her eyes were black and red, and she fought fiercely. It took me, my partner, and 3 paramedics to hold her down. As she screamed, she seemed to stare at something invisible in the corner, begging it not to kill her. Her husband stood nearby, oddly calm, and explained that this started after she visited a holy site in Singapore and fell ill. Her sister usually stopped these episodes with a powder and a cross, but she wasn't around. We eventually got her to the hospital, but the memory of her strength and terror still haunts me. Story 3. We were sent to check on someone who wasn't answering their door or phone. Arriving at the house, we noticed every window was covered with curtains or paper. Inside, it looked like someone had just eaten. Bread on the table, juice in glasses, and children's toys scattered around. Then we found a suicide note. My heart pounded as we searched the house, preparing for the worst. The bathroom was empty, but the attic was our last stop. Slowly, we climbed the stairs. There, hanging from a beam, was the homeowner. The chilling contrast between the eerie normalcy of the house and the grim scene in the attic is something I'll never forget. Story 4. It was Halloween night, and I was patrolling near a lake. As I slowed at a stop sign, something caught my eye in a tree along the walking path. Thinking it was a Halloween decoration, I got out to investigate. My flashlight revealed it wasn't a decoration. It was a man hanging. As I processed what I was seeing, I noticed a group of trick-or-treating kids heading my way. I quickly intercepted their parent and urged them to take a different route. Later, I learned the man was a 20-year-old who took his life after a breakup. Tragically, he chose a spot where his ex-girlfriend would have seen him from her window the next morning. Story 5. One night, I was riding along with a friend, a police officer, when he got a call about noises in someone's basement. He told me to wait in the car while he checked it out. After a long 30 minutes, he came back, pale and shaken. He said the homeowner had been hearing loud thuds for weeks and thought someone had broken into the walk-in basement. While checking the electrical panel, my friend noticed a figure standing silently at the end of a hallway. He shouted at it to turn around, but it didn't move. When he turned on the lights, the figure was gone. He searched the basement thoroughly but found nothing. His terrified expression told me he wasn't exaggerating. Story 6. I was patrolling the Oregon coast late one stormy night when I found a woman walking after crashing her car into a parked school bus. Her car had caught fire, but she had escaped. I called out to her to stop, and when she turned around, I froze. Her lower jaw was missing. Her tongue stuck out from her exposed neck as she tried to talk, dazed and bloodied. She survived after extensive surgery, but the sight of her injuries and the surreal nature of that encounter stayed with me long after that night. Story 7. As a resident director at a college dorm, I was used to late-night wellness checks. This time, a worried mother hadn't heard from her daughter in 3 days. The student was a quiet, withdrawn type, so I prepared myself for the worst. When I entered the room, I was relieved to find her alive and busy. She and her new boyfriend had turned the dorm into a giant fort, complete with separate rooms. They were so engrossed in their video games and other activities that they hadn't heard me knocking. I was relieved, but the tension I felt before entering the room lingered for a while. Story 8. My partner and I were called to an elderly couple's house after they reported a man walking on their property. The man, described as zombie-like, disappeared into a cornfield before we arrived. We searched the area but found nothing. The couple was visibly shaken, and their description of his slow, downward gaze and unusual behavior left us uneasy. We patrolled the area for a while, but the man seemed to have vanished. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of unease from that night. Story 9. I responded to a burglary alarm at a mortuary late at night. A rear door was open, so I had to search the entire building. Inside, it was dark and silent. One room held a body on a table, waiting to be processed. As I walked through, I saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. When I turned my flashlight, there was nothing there. Suddenly, I smelled a strong perfume, strangely out of place in the mortuary. I completed the search as quickly as possible, but the unsettling mix of perfume and the dark, eerie atmosphere stayed with me long after. Story 10. One night, I stopped a man approaching the White House. He was bleeding from shallow cuts on his wrists and neck. He claimed to be a 60-year-old secret agent working for J. Edgar Hoover and insisted he had urgent information for President Obama. I detained him, treated his wounds, and had him committed for a mental health evaluation. Later, I learned he was just a college student struggling with severe mental health issues. I've encountered many strange situations at the White House, but this one stands out as one of the most bizarre. Story 11. I was working as a correctional officer in Texas when we responded to a horrific incident. A prisoner had slit the inside of his elbow, leaving a deep gash that caused a massive pool of blood on the cell floor. When we entered, the metallic smell of blood hit me like a wall. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The man had been lying there for so long that the blood had coagulated. As we lifted his barely conscious body, the blood, now jelly-like, fell off his arm in chunks. It was shocking and surreal, something I never expected to encounter. The sight, the smell, and the texture of the blood made it one of the most disturbing experiences of my career. While we were trained in basic medical aid, nothing could have prepared us for this. After the inmate was stabilized and transported to the hospital, I couldn't shake the image from my head. Even now, years later, the memory of that day makes my stomach turn. It taught me just how unpredictable and grim this line of work could be, and how crucial it was to brace for anything, no matter how unimaginable. Story 12. We received a call about a missing child, and when we arrived at the home, the mother was frantic. She explained that her son had been playing in the backyard, and then he was gone. The property was large and wooded, with no clear boundary fence, so I decided to begin my search there while others checked the house. After about 10 minutes of searching, I found the boy caught on an old, hidden chain-link fence deep in the woods. It was horrifying. He had been strangled to death by his hoodie, which had snagged on the fence. I froze for a moment, processing what I was seeing, before calling it in. The worst part was knowing I'd have to break the news to the boy's mother. As I walked back to the house, I could hear her sobbing, and my heart sank. Every step felt heavier as I prepared to deliver the devastating news. That day left a scar on my memory. It wasn't just the tragic loss of a young life, but the thought of how quickly an innocent moment of play could turn into something so heartbreaking. Story 13. One of the most disturbing cases I ever worked involved a man who had brutally murdered his stepfather and then attempted to kill his grandparents. We arrived at the grandparents' house to find chaos. The grandmother came running out with a Bowie knife lodged in her eye. Incredibly, she had survived because the blade missed her brain by a fraction of an inch. The compass on the knife's handle spun wildly as she moved, an image that is burned into my mind. Inside, her husband was unconscious on the floor, surrounded by a pool of vomit. The scene was surreal and nightmarish, but we acted quickly to get the grandmother medical attention while securing the area. Amazingly, she survived the attack, and we apprehended the suspect shortly after. The sheer brutality of the crime, combined with the fact that the grandmother managed to run out with the knife still in her eye, was something I could never forget. It was the kind of case that reminded me of just how unpredictable and terrifying human behavior could be. Story 14. My sibling, a police officer, once told me about a call they responded to near Detroit. Neighbors reported loud banging and screaming from an apartment, followed by silence. By the time anyone called, A foul smell had begun to seep from the unit. When my sibling and their partner arrived, they found the door unlocked. Inside, the living room was in shambles. Furniture flipped, a broken TV, and holes in the walls. As they searched, they found the woman who had lived there, sitting lifelessly against the bedroom door. She had been bludgeoned to death with a piece of the bed frame. What made it even worse were the bloody handprints and smears all over the room, including the window. It was clear she had tried desperately to escape but was unable to open the nailed-shut window. Even her cat, who survived, had been scavenging from her face out of starvation. The suspect, her boyfriend, was never caught. My siblings said the scene was one of the most haunting they'd ever witnessed, not just because of the violence but because of the sheer desperation and terror the victim must have felt in her final moments. Story 15. Late one night, we booked a man who was immediately unsettling. He twitched, snapped his head back and forth, and muttered incoherently. While processing him, he suddenly looked directly at one of my coworkers and asked, "Would you blame me for it?" Playing along to keep him calm, my coworker replied, "No, man. No one would blame you." That's when the man leapt off the bench. It took both of us to hold him down while he thrashed violently. His strength was shocking. It felt like the bolted bench would rip from the floor. Once he was restrained again, he threw his head back, his eyes rolled into his skull, and he let out a guttural, inhuman scream. For nearly an hour, he alternated between screaming and talking like a normal person before slipping back into a trance-like state. The haunting sound of his scream and the sheer unpredictability of his behavior stuck with me. I've dealt with many unstable individuals over the years, but there was something about him that felt otherworldly. To this day, I can't hear screams like that in movies without thinking about that night. Story 16. A missing persons case led me to one of the most chilling discoveries of my career. A husband had told his family he was going to get his tires changed, but he never returned. His wife assured us he wouldn't harm himself, though his recent behavior, like transferring all his money into her account, raised red flags. On a hunch, I asked their son if his dad had a favorite spot in the nearby mountains. The son mentioned an old forest road. I decided to check it out, even though it was late at night. After an hour of driving up the snowy, abandoned road, I found nothing and began doubting my instincts. But on the way back, I decided to check one of the smaller side roads. There it was, his black truck. My heart raced as I approached. Inside, I found the man had taken his life with a shotgun. The scene was gruesome, and the quiet isolation of the mountain made it even more haunting. The worst part was returning to his family, who had been holding on to hope, and delivering the devastating news. Story 17. It was nearly midnight when we got a call about a man who had jumped off a bridge into the bay. On the way down, he hit a guardrail, severing both his forearms and part of the top of his head. When we arrived, officers had already collected his arms and set them aside. As part of the dive team, it was my job to recover the rest of his remains. When we found his body, something was missing, his brain. I lifted his scalp to confirm, but it was completely gone. We searched the water for hours, finding pieces of his skull but never his brain. The strange absence of something so vital was deeply unsettling. The incident stuck with me, not just because of the gruesome recovery but because of the eerie mystery surrounding his missing brain. It's something I've never been able to fully explain or forget. Story 18. We were investigating a missing persons case involving a married couple. The husband's credit card was used to purchase an engagement ring, which led us to their son. Under questioning, the son confessed to killing both parents and burying them in shallow graves. He took us to the site and what we found was horrifying. Both bodies had black garbage bags over their heads, secured with duct tape around their necks. The sight of their faces when the bags were removed, along with the overwhelming smell of decomposition, is something I'll never forget. The son showed no remorse, which made the situation even more chilling. To this day, I can still picture that scene in vivid detail. Story 19. I responded to a domestic disturbance call and found a young woman screaming in her yard. She was wearing a t-shirt and had blood running down her legs. Inside the house, her husband lay unconscious, surrounded by vomit. The house was filthy. Cigarettes, maggots, diapers, and rotten food everywhere. Two terrified children were huddled on the couch. I escorted them outside and went searching for their baby sibling. Finding the crib, I braced myself, expecting the worst. To my relief, the baby was alive, though neglected and covered in dried feces. The entire situation was surreal. I called for additional help, and the family was taken to safety. That night, I realized how deeply some situations can affect you, no matter how much training you've had. Story 20. My grandmother, a retired homicide detective, once told me a story I'll never forget. A couple called the police because their baby was missing. My grandmother and her partner arrived to investigate. They found traces of blood near the crib and outside by the doghouse. After questioning the couple, the horrifying truth came out. The husband, exhausted from the baby's crying, had snapped and repeatedly slammed the child against a wall. Panicked, they decided to feed the baby's remains to their German shepherd. My grandmother said it was one of the most disturbing cases of her career. The brutality and inhumanity of their actions shocked her to her core. Even now, when she talks about it, you can see how deeply it affected her. Story 21. My dad once recounted a chilling story from his time as a small-town police officer in the 1960s and 70s. Late one night, he pulled over a bus filled with people. It was standard protocol to ask where travelers were headed, and the group replied that they were on their way to California. My dad let them go, thinking nothing of it. Later, he learned that the bus was carrying Charles Manson and his infamous group. On another occasion, he pulled over a car for a routine check. The driver, calm and polite, chatted briefly with my dad before being allowed to leave. A few towns over, that same man shot and killed a police officer during a traffic stop. When questioned, the man admitted he had been planning to kill my dad too, but he decided against it because my dad had been too nice. These brushes with dangerous individuals have always made me think about how small interactions can determine life or death. Story 22. As part of the State Police Crime Unit, I was called to assist with a gruesome discovery in a row of small apartment homes. Neighbors had reported an unbearable smell coming from a second-floor unit. When I arrived, the coroner warned me to prepare for the worst. The smell hit me before I even entered the building. Inside, the heat of July had turned the apartment into a gruesome scene. The man had died by suicide with a gun, but his body had decomposed to the point where he was unrecognizable. His skin had melted into the floor, and maggots writhed beneath it, making it appear as though his skin was moving. The metallic stench, the flies, and the sheer horror of the scene were overwhelming. It took the fire department shovels to scrape his remains from the floor. That day left a mark on me, a reminder of how fragile and grim life can be. Story 23. It was Christmas morning in 2004, when I received a call about a young man who had turned himself in at a station 600 kilometers away. He claimed to have shot his grandmother the night before. My partner and I drove to the address, unsure if it was a prank. The house was locked, and there was no response. After searching for an open window, I managed to pry one open, and what I saw inside still haunts me. The grandmother, alive but barely, was staring up at me with bloodied and pleading eyes. She had been shot in the head but somehow survived overnight. The house smelled of decay, worsened by her soiling herself. While waiting for the ambulance, I tried to spray perfume to mask the smell, but the mix of perfume and bodily odors only made it worse. She died in the hospital a week later. The grandson was charged with murder, and that Christmas forever changed how I feel about the holiday season. Story 24. My cousin, a police officer, once responded to a tragic Valentine's Day call. A 12-year-old girl had called 911 to report that her mother had shot herself in the living room. When my cousin arrived, he found the scene haunting. The dinner table was set with plates, drinks, and food, as if the family had been preparing for a celebration. Instead, the mother had taken her own life in front of her children. The girl and her younger brother were sitting outside, visibly shaken and unable to comprehend what had happened. My cousin said the contrast between the festive setup and the horrific act stuck with him. He often wonders how those kids managed to cope with such a traumatic experience on what was supposed to be a day of love. Story 25. My grandfather's suicide still haunts me. He had been helping my cousin with a school project, acting completely normal, when he decided to get a glass of water. Afterward, he drove my cousin to our aunt's house, dropped her off and returned home. Minutes later, he shot himself in his bedroom. My dad and I lived next door, and when I noticed his car in the driveway but got no response from knocking, I felt uneasy. I told my dad, and he kicked the door in, finding my grandfather's lifeless body. Years later, we still wonder if he was silently battling a condition, or if the loss of his youngest daughter to cancer 2 years earlier had broken him. He had mentioned hearing her voice at night. That moment taught me a painful truth. Someone has to find you after you're gone, and it changes them forever. If you're struggling, please reach out. There's always someone who cares. Story 26. I'll never forget the call about the abandoned house on the edge of town. Neighbors reported strange noises, crying and whispers, coming from the property late at night. The house had been empty for years, so my partner and I assumed it was kids messing around. When we arrived, the place was dark and silent. The front door was ajar, creaking in the wind. Inside, the air felt heavy, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. We cleared the first floor quickly, finding nothing but old furniture and dust. Then we heard it, a muffled sobbing sound coming from upstairs. My partner and I exchanged uneasy glances before heading up. In one of the bedrooms, we found a girl, maybe 14 years old, sitting in the corner. She was rocking back and forth, her face buried in her knees. When we asked her name, she didn't respond, but her sobbing grew louder. As I approached, she suddenly stopped, lifted her head, and there was nothing in her eyes, just emptiness. Before I could react, she bolted past us and disappeared down the stairs. We searched the entire house and the surrounding area, but she was gone. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I'll never forget her hollow, lifeless stare. Story 27. One winter night, I responded to a call about a man found unconscious in a car at a rest stop. When I arrived, the snow was falling heavily, and the car was barely visible under a layer of white. I opened the door and found the man slumped over the steering wheel, shivering and barely conscious. He muttered something incoherent as I tried to help him out of the car. In the back seat, I noticed something odd, an old suitcase with dozens of photographs spilling out. They were all of the same little boy, taken over several years. Some were innocent, showing the boy smiling at school or playing in a park. Others were unsettling. Photos taken from outside a window, showing him sleeping or eating dinner. The man was rushed to the hospital for hypothermia, and we later learned he was a distant relative of the boy, obsessed with him for years. The boy's family had no idea he had been stalking them. That case shook me to my core. The idea that someone could watch a family so closely, unnoticed, while documenting their lives in secret, still sends chills down my spine. Story 28. The call came in just after 3 a.m. A woman had called 911, screaming that her husband had locked himself in their bedroom with their baby. When we arrived, she was hysterical, begging us to save her child. My partner and I forced the door open, and what we found was horrifying. The husband was standing in the middle of the room, holding the baby tightly to his chest. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was muttering something under his breath, over and over. We couldn't make out the words, but it sounded almost like a prayer. Blood was dripping down his arms, and I noticed a knife on the floor beside him. He hadn't harmed the baby yet, but his arms were covered in self-inflicted cuts. My partner managed to calm him down enough to let go of the baby, and we quickly restrained him. Later, we learned he had been battling severe post-traumatic stress and had a psychotic break that night. The baby was unharmed, but the image of him standing there, bloodied and desperate, stays with me. It's a stark reminder of how fragile the human mind can be. Story 29. There was a call about a man seen standing on the edge of a highway overpass, looking down at the traffic below. When I arrived, he was still there, gripping the railing tightly. I approached him slowly, keeping my voice calm. He told me he had lost everything. His job, his family, his will to live. He said he didn't want to jump, but he felt like he had no choice. I stayed with him for over an hour, talking about anything and everything, sports, the weather, his favorite childhood memories. Slowly, he began to open up. Tears streamed down his face as he confessed how lonely he felt. Eventually, he let me guide him away from the edge. I thought about him for weeks afterward. I wondered if he found the help he needed or if he was still struggling. That night taught me how important it is to listen, even when it feels like you're not making a difference. Sometimes just being there can be enough. Story 30. I was called to a quiet suburban home where a woman had reported hearing footsteps in her attic. She lived alone and was terrified. When I arrived, she explained that it wasn't the first time she'd heard the noises, but tonight they were louder. I climbed up to the attic, flashlight in hand, expecting to find a raccoon or some other animal. Instead, I found a small mattress, a pile of empty food wrappers, and a notebook. Someone had been living up there. The woman was horrified when I showed her the evidence. She had been in and out of the house daily, completely unaware that someone had been watching her from above. We never caught the person, but the notebook revealed sketches of the woman, drawn from angles inside her home. It made my skin crawl. I couldn't imagine how she must have felt, knowing she had shared her house with a stranger. To this day, I double-check every attic I enter, just in case. Story 31. It was a routine welfare check on an elderly man who hadn't been seen by his neighbors in days. When I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. I knocked several times before deciding to force the door open. Inside, the air was thick with an awful smell, and the house was freezing cold. I found him in his recliner, staring blankly at the television, which was still on. At first, I thought he was deceased, but then I noticed his chest moving faintly. He was alive but severely dehydrated and malnourished. He had fallen and been unable to get up for days. What broke my heart was the look in his eyes when he saw me. Relief and desperation all at once. He had been lying there, alone and helpless, waiting for someone to find him. We got him to the hospital in time, but I couldn't stop thinking about how easily he could have been forgotten. It made me realize how many people live in isolation, with no one to check on them. That call stayed with me, a reminder of how vital it is to look out for one another. Story 32. A frantic 911 call came in about a child locked in a car at a mall parking lot. It was summer, and the temperature was dangerously high. When I arrived, I found a woman screaming and pointing at the car. Inside, a toddler was strapped into a car seat, his face red and his eyes rolling back. The windows were slightly cracked, but it wasn't enough to keep the heat out. I smashed the window and pulled the child out, his body limp in my arms. Paramedics arrived moments later and managed to stabilize him. The mother, who had left him in the car, just for a few minutes, was hysterical when she realized how close she had come to losing him. The child survived, but the experience stuck with me. The sight of his small, overheated body and the panic in his mother's eyes were a stark reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. It made me hyper-aware of the dangers of heat and how easily tragedies like this can happen. Story 33. I was dispatched to a remote cabin after a 911 hang-up. The area was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the caller hadn't answered our return attempts. When I arrived, the cabin was silent. I knocked, announced myself, but no one responded. Then I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Inside, the cabin seemed lived in, warm food on the stove and a jacket tossed on a chair. But there was no sign of anyone. I checked every room, calling out, but the house was empty. Then I saw muddy footprints leading from the back door into the woods. They stopped abruptly about 50 feet from the cabin, as though the person had vanished into thin air. I radioed for backup, but we never found anyone. The caller was never identified, and no one reported anyone missing in that area. To this day, the mystery of who made that call and where they went haunts me. Story 34. It was my first month on the job when I responded to a call about a woman screaming in an apartment complex. I found her sitting on the floor of a hallway, crying and clutching her stomach. She told me her boyfriend had locked himself in their apartment after an argument. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Eventually, we forced our way in. The first thing I noticed was the silence, an eerie contrast to the chaos outside. Then I saw him hanging by a belt from the ceiling fan. A note was taped to the wall beside him. I'll never forget the woman's scream when she saw him. It was raw, guttural, and filled with pain. That scream stayed with me for weeks. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night hearing it. Story 35. A late-night call led me to a local park, where a jogger had reported finding a body. The park was quiet, lit only by the dim glow of streetlights. As I approached the crime scene, I saw a young man lying face down in the grass. At first, I thought he had been attacked, given the blood pooling around him. But as I got closer, I noticed the gun still in his hand. He had taken his own life. What struck me most was the small, framed photo lying next to him. It was of a young woman and a child, smiling brightly. Later, I learned he had recently gone through a messy divorce and lost custody of his son. That photo, left beside him, said more than any note ever could. It was a tragedy that reminded me how fragile people can be, especially when they feel like they've lost everything. Story 36. The call was for a car accident on a rural highway. When I arrived, the scene was chaos. Flashing lights, shattered glass, and the crumpled remains of a sedan wrapped around a tree. Inside the car was a young woman, unconscious but alive. In the back seat, a toddler sat in his car seat, crying but unharmed. I focused on calming the child while paramedics worked to free the mother. Hours later, I visited the hospital to check on them. The mother was awake and asked me about her son. When I told her he was safe, she broke down crying, thanking me over and over. It was one of the rare moments in this job where I felt like a true hero. Story 37. A 911 call came from a small motel on the edge of town. The caller claimed to hear someone crying in the room next door but couldn't confirm what was happening. I arrived to find the motel manager waiting nervously. He led me to the room, where I could indeed hear muffled sobbing. I knocked and announced myself, but there was no response. With the manager's permission, I entered. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. In the corner, a young woman was curled up, crying softly. She wouldn't speak, but I noticed bruises on her arms and face. Eventually, I learned she had escaped an abusive relationship and fled to the motel for safety. She had no family nearby, no one to call. That night, I connected her with a local shelter and made sure she had a safe place to go. It wasn't the most dramatic call, but it was one of the most rewarding. Story 38. I responded to a report of a suspicious vehicle parked on a quiet street. When I arrived, the car was running, its headlights piercing the foggy night. Inside, a man sat motionless, staring straight ahead. I tapped on the window, but he didn't respond. When I opened the door, I realized he wasn't breathing. The strong smell of exhaust hit me immediately, and I saw the hose leading from the tailpipe into the car's window. On the passenger seat was a handwritten note. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply read, "I'm sorry." I'll never forget the eerie stillness of that moment. The fog, the quiet street, and the man who had chosen it as the place to end his life. Story 39. I was called to a daycare after hours. The owner had arrived to lock up for the night and noticed a shadow moving inside. Fearing a break-in, she called us. When I arrived, the building was dark and quiet. I entered cautiously, flashlight in hand. At first, everything seemed normal. Tiny chairs, colorful posters, and toys scattered on the floor. Then I heard it, a faint giggle. I followed the sound to one of the playrooms, where I found a small boy sitting on the floor. He looked up at me, smiled, and then vanished. I searched the entire building, but there was no sign of him. The daycare's owner said no children had been there for hours. I don't believe in ghosts, but that night made me question everything. Story 40. A frantic call led me to a house where a woman claimed her teenage son had locked himself in the bathroom. She was pounding on the door, begging him to come out. I arrived and managed to get the door open. Inside, her son was unconscious on the floor. A bottle of pills lay spilled beside him, and his breathing was shallow. I called for paramedics and stayed with him until they arrived. The mother's sobs as she held her son's hand broke my heart. Later, I learned he had been bullied at school and felt like he couldn't take it anymore. Thankfully, he survived, but that night made me realize how critical it is to pay attention to the struggles people often keep hidden. Story 41. I responded to a burglary alarm at a jewelry store late one night. When I arrived, the glass door had been shattered, and the alarm was blaring. I entered cautiously, flashlight in hand. As I cleared the store, I noticed movement behind the counter. I shouted for the person to come out, and a boy no older than 12 emerged. He was shaking, clutching a small bag of candy from the display near the register. He broke down crying, saying he was hungry and didn't know what else to do. I couldn't arrest him, not for something like this. Instead, I called his parents, who arrived in tears. They explained they had fallen on hard times and didn't even realize he had left the house. That night, I helped connect them with resources, but the sight of that boy, scared and desperate, stayed with me. Story 42. One spring evening, I was sent to a nursing home after staff reported an elderly man wandering the halls, calling out for his wife. When I arrived, I found him sitting in the common room, clutching a photo of a younger woman. He told me his wife had passed away years ago, but tonight he had dreamed she was waiting for him in the hallway. He seemed so certain, so hopeful, that it broke my heart. I sat with him for a while, listening as he told me about their life together. Eventually, he grew tired and let the staff guide him back to his room. As I left, I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness for the loneliness he must have felt, waiting for a reunion that would never come. Story 43. I was dispatched to a quiet neighborhood after a woman reported hearing heavy breathing on her baby monitor. She was terrified, convinced someone was in her house. When I arrived, she and her husband were waiting outside, clutching their baby. I checked every room in the house, but it was empty. Then I examined the baby monitor. It was an older model, the kind that could pick up nearby frequencies. The breathing wasn't coming from inside their home. It was coming from a neighbor's device. I knocked on a few doors and eventually found the source. An elderly man on oxygen who lived alone. The woman was relieved, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man. He had no family, and the only reason we discovered him was because of a baby monitor. It was a bittersweet moment, realizing how easily someone can fade into isolation. Story 44. A call came in from a frantic teenager who said she heard strange noises in her basement. She was home alone, and the power had gone out. When I arrived, she was trembling on the front porch, flashlight in hand. The basement was pitch dark, cluttered with old furniture and boxes. As I swept the area, I heard a faint rustling sound. My heart raced as I followed the noise to a stack of old crates. When I shone my flashlight, I saw a raccoon staring back at me. It was a simple call, but the fear in that girl's voice reminded me how terrifying it can be to face the unknown. To her, it wasn't just a raccoon. It was the monster she imagined as a child. Sometimes, it's not the danger itself but the fear that leaves the biggest impression. Story 45. I responded to a welfare check at a retirement home where a resident hadn't been seen in days. When I arrived, the staff explained that the man, a widower, often kept to himself. I entered his room and found it meticulously clean. On the desk was a stack of letters, each addressed to his late wife. They were filled with updates about his life, written as if she were still alive. The last letter, left unfinished, was dated 3 days earlier, the day he passed away in his sleep. The room was quiet, almost peaceful, but the sight of those letters broke my heart. It was a reminder of how love can endure, even in solitude, and how some people find comfort in holding on to the past. Story 46. A call came in about a man wandering through traffic on the highway. When I arrived, I found him walking barefoot along the shoulder, muttering to himself. His clothes were torn, and he was covered in scratches. He wouldn't respond to my questions, but he kept repeating, "I have to find her." Eventually, I got him to sit down and I called for medical assistance. As I waited, I learned that he had been searching for his missing daughter for years. He had walked miles that night, convinced she was nearby. It turned out she had died in a car accident years earlier, but he couldn't let go. That night, I saw the devastating weight of grief and how it can push someone to the edge of reason. Story 47. We were called to investigate a suspicious vehicle parked by a lake. When we arrived, the car was abandoned, but the trunk was open. Inside, we found a wedding dress, still in its protective bag, and a note that simply read, "I'm sorry." We searched the area and eventually found a young woman sitting at the water's edge, staring out at the lake. She told us she had been left at the altar that day and had come there to think. She wasn't a danger to herself, but the pain in her voice was palpable. I stayed with her for a while, just listening. Sometimes people don't need a rescue, they just need someone to hear them. That night, I understood the quiet power of simply being present. Story 48. A late-night call came in about a small child wandering alone in a parking lot. When I arrived, I found a little boy, no older than 4, clutching a stuffed bear. He wouldn't speak, just pointed in the direction of a nearby gas station. After some coaxing, I walked with him to the station, where we found his mother sobbing by the payphone. She explained that they were homeless and had been evicted from their motel earlier that day. She had been trying to call a shelter when her son wandered off. I helped connect them with resources, but the memory of that child, lost, scared, and clutching his bear, has stayed with me. It was a stark reminder of how easily people can slip through the cracks. Story 49. I responded to a call about a man refusing to leave a hospital room. When I arrived, I found him sitting beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of an unconscious woman. The nurse explained that the woman was his wife and that she had passed away earlier that day. He refused to believe it, insisting she was just asleep and would wake up soon. I sat with him for hours, gently talking to him, trying to help him process the loss. Eventually, he let go of her hand and allowed the staff to take her. It was one of the most emotional calls I've ever been on. Watching someone grapple with the immediate, raw pain of losing a loved one is something I'll never forget. Story 50. A 911 call reported a child crying in a wooded area behind a suburban neighborhood. When I arrived, I followed the sound and found a little girl sitting under a tree, clutching a doll. She was barefoot and shivering but unharmed. When I asked her what happened, she said she had run away from home because her parents were fighting. She said she thought the woods would be quieter. I carried her back to my patrol car and drove her home. Her parents were frantic when we arrived. They hugged her tightly and thanked me over and over. It was a small moment, but it reminded me how quickly a situation can become dangerous, and how important it is to act fast. Story 51. I was called to a downtown bridge where a man was threatening to jump. When I arrived, he was standing on the edge, staring down at the river below. I approached cautiously, talking to him softly. He told me he had lost his job and felt like a failure. He said he couldn't face his family anymore. I asked him about his kids and what they liked to do together. Slowly, he began to open up. After an hour, he stepped back from the edge and let me help him down. As I drove him to the hospital, he thanked me and said, "You're the first person who's really listened to me in a long time." That moment stayed with me, a reminder of how powerful compassion can be. Story 52. A call about a strange smell led me to a small apartment. The tenant was an elderly woman who hadn't been seen in weeks. When I entered, I found her sitting in her recliner, surrounded by unopened letters and bills. She had passed away quietly, with no one to notice. What struck me most was the calendar on the wall, where she had written, "Dinner with Sally," on the day she died. Sally turned out to be her daughter, who hadn't visited in years. The scene was heartbreaking. It made me think about how many people live and die in isolation, with no one to share their final days. That call left a lasting impression on me, a reminder of the importance of connection.